This next PowerPoint is going to go over the principles of design. This is the other important set of principles that we are going to talk about for 2D Foundations. Each one of our projects is based off of one of these principles. So there are 5 principles of design that we are going to look at this semester. The first of which is unity and variety, balance, emphasis and subordination, scale and proportion, and rhythm. There are also 2 important vocabulary terms that we will talk about throughout the course of this semester. The first one is composition. Composition is the organization of the elements of art within a 2-dimensional work of art. You can imagine this being 2D foundations, we are mostly going to be talking about compositions. Design is the other vocabulary word, and design is similar to composition, but it can be applied to all kinds of art, including 3-dimensional art and time-based pieces. So the first principle that we are going to talk about is unity versus variety. Unity is a sense of oneness, of things belonging together, and they make up a coherent whole. Variety is difference, which provides interest. They're often discussed together because the 2 of them generally coexist in a work of art. If a work has too much unity, it can be a little bit boring. If it has too much variety, it can be confusing. So in a good work of art, there is a balance between both. So let's look at this first piece by Henri Matisse and think about how unity and variety is being used. Well, when looking at the principles of art, you first have to think about the elements of art. What elements of art are being used in this piece? You're right. We have shapes, right? We have color, and we have line. There's a lot of similarities in shapes, like we see very many geometric shapes, rectangles and squares. Those are unifying elements, but we also see organic shapes spread throughout. So there's variety within the organic and the geometric shapes. We also see very many geometric lines up against loose, irregular lines. Color-wise, there's a lot of similar cool colors, right, with the blues and greens, but we have some warm colors that add pops of variety to the mix. The piece by Jackson Pollock. This doesn't quite have the same amount of unity as the last piece, right? There's a lot of variety, including many different colors. But there is some things that bring unity to it. If you look at the mark making of each one of those lines, there's a similarity to it. It's what helps to unify the piece. Here's a piece by Annette Messenger. What is the unifying element of this piece? Shape, right? There's a lot of square shapes. There's a lot of similar lines. There's also an element of conceptual unity. If you look at each one of those individual elements, they're all body parts. So conceptually, each one of the symbolism within the piece, having each little individual body part, is also a unifying element. But the shapes of each one of those elements is a little bit different. So we have the shape of the lips, or we have the shape of a hand, or we have the shape of a tongue. That helps add variety to it. It's a piece by Joseph Cornell. What are the unifying elements in this piece? We have squares, circles, right? A lot of geometric shapes will help give us variety. Those organic elements of the bird, the ripped up sign. Color also is a unifying element with the whites, but we have these bright pops of yellow and green in the bird. Balance is the next principle that we'll look at. Balance refers to visual weight. It means the apparent heaviness or lightness of the forms that are arranged in the composition. There are two types of visual weight or balance. The first one is symmetrical balance. Symmetrical balance implies the center of gravity is an imaginary line drawn down the middle of the composition. Forms or shapes on either side correspond to each other in size, shape, and placement, so they feel equally balanced. Asymmetrical balance refers to a composition that has two sides that do not match, so there is an imbalance in the visual weight. Let's look at this first piece. What type of balance do you see? Is this symmetrical or asymmetrical? If you said symmetrical, you're correct. If you notice, this piece would probably fall over if it was asymmetrically balanced. If I take and I draw that individual little line down through the middle of that sculpture, there's even visual weight on either side. How about this piece, symmetrical or asymmetrical? Symmetrical, right? If I draw that line down the middle, there's equal visual weight on either side. How about this piece? Symmetrical or asymmetrical? You said symmetrical, correct. Although I'm not necessarily drawing a line down the middle this way, I can also draw a line down the middle this way, right? So this piece is called Reflect 2. It's meant to look as if there's a reflection in the water, and each side is very equally balanced. What about this piece by Edward Weston? Symmetrical or asymmetrical? If we draw that line down the middle, the same thing. It implies a vertical axis of symmetrical balance. Is that each side exactly the same? Not completely, but it's something called relief symmetry that's often used to express harmony or balance. A good example of that is in this Georgia O'Keeffe piece. Draw that line down the middle. Not quite totally balanced. This side has got a little bit more weight, but it's balanced by the visual weight of the mountain behind it. So it's called relief symmetry. Still symmetrical, but with just a little bit of two different, slightly different visual weights meant to balance each other out. You can see that too with this piece by Frida Kahlo, which is also considered relief symmetry or approximate symmetry. Obviously equally balanced by the two images of Frida on either side. She saw this as a balance of her two personalities. On the left, she's wearing a native dress. Oftentimes, Frida wore native Mexican dresses to explore that side of her personality. On the right, if you can see, she's holding a tiny picture of Diego Rivera, her husband. She often found herself sort of dually pulled by her double identity and who she thought she was meant to be. So you can kind of see that conflict between those two Fridas. There's also another type of symmetrical balance known as radial symmetry. Oftentimes this is seen in mandalas. It's used as a way to meditate and sort of contemplate the balance within nature and the universe. Radial symmetry means that all sides are equally balanced, so no matter which way I draw that line, anywhere in that circle, they're equally visually balanced. You can see this in nature too, with snowflakes. You can also see it with starfish. There's a huge amounts of radial symmetry out there in the natural world. So the next type of symmetry we're going to talk about is asymmetrical symmetry. Asymmetry is two sides that do not match. So let's look at a couple examples here. And I want you guys to look at each one of these numbers 1 through 6, and let's think about which side is visually heavier. So in the first one, we've got two white little ovals. Which one is heavier, the left or the right? If you said left, you're correct. A larger form is visually heavier than a smaller form. How about number 2? Left or right? If you said left, you're also correct. A dark value form is visually heavier than a light value form of the same size. How about number 3? Left or right? If you said left again, you're correct. A textured form is visually heavier than a smooth form of the same size. How about number 4? This one always confuses people. Technically, it's meant to be left. A complex form is visually heavier than a simple form of the same size. Unfortunately, I don't think this is a great illustration of it because the one on the left makes it look like there's holes cut out of it. So I would almost say the right looks visually heavier. You can see this isn't exact science, but there's general rules that something weights something more than the other. But number 5. This is a trick question. The idea is that 2 or more small forms can balance a larger one, so those two can feel equally weighted. Number 6 is a similar trick question. When you have a smaller dark form, it can help to balance a larger light one. So you can have something smaller and darker balance something lighter that's larger. So how do you go about balancing a composition? Well, it's more when it looks balanced. This isn't an exact science. If you look at this piece by Gustav Klimt, there's a much larger mass on the right-hand side balanced by a much darker mass that's smaller on the left-hand side. This piece still feels balanced though, even though there's a much smaller space on the left-hand side. This also has some symbolic meaning. If you can guess, the symbol on the left is meant to symbolize death. The figure on the right is life. All of the birth cycle is represented. How about this piece? Is it balanced? This is an example of extreme asymmetry. And it's done for a conceptual purpose. And if you can see, it's a little bit light. Up in the left-hand corner is a monk meditating. The lower right-hand side is meant to symbolize his gaze into nothingness. So sort of about meditation in Zen and Buddhism. You can see, without that space, it's meant to kind of show the emptiness of the mind, and that large, wider space is balanced by that smaller, darker space. This is a much busier example of asymmetrical balance. This is Turner's The Burning of the House of Parliament. You can see the left-hand side represents a fire, obviously from the burning of the House of Parliament. So our street is really pulled to the left-hand side, meant to envision the excitement of the flames. We're meant to journey around the painting. We're then brought back to the lower right-hand side where we view all the spectators viewing what's happening to the Parliament. One last example of symmetry. Would you describe this as asymmetrical or symmetrical balance? Well, if we draw a line down the middle, woman, the foreground is very balanced. The bottles over here are balanced by the bottles, and the oranges over here. In the background, there's something that's causing some asymmetrical balance. If you see these two figures over here, and there's a little bit of a mystery behind her. Is that her reflection, or is it another figure? This piece is often talked about as a reflection, even though I'm quite not right about the perspective. If that is her reflection, we are then the man in the top hat. The next principle of design that we're going to talk about is emphasis and subordination. Emphasis is when attention is drawn to one or more certain areas of a composition than others. And a focal point is where the emphasis is on a relatively small, clearly defined area. And subordination is where certain areas of the composition are purposely made less visually interesting so that the areas of emphasis stand out. This is kind of like unity and variety. Without some kind of subordination, you won't have any areas of emphasis or focal points. So let's look at a few examples of those. This first one is by Henry Oswald Tanner, The Banjo Lesson. Can you point out any areas of emphasis or places where our eyes are drawn first? Clearly our eye is drawn towards the central figures, right? You see those in the center. Sort of a larger area of emphasis. Is there a focal point that our eyes go to first or more closely? Look, very focused on the area of the hands. Is there any areas that are subordinate? These darker areas along the outside, right, or the whiter areas with less detail, help to pull our eye back into the action of the two figures learning to play the banjo. There's also contrast, so the very dark against very light help to create an area of emphasis and draw our eyes in. Let's next look at this piece by Paul Cézanne. Are there any areas of emphasis that you see? Of course, our eye goes towards the center of the picture plane at first. Are there any areas that are subordinate or less interesting? Well, clearly we have these outer areas of the piece. Generally it'll have less bright colors, less contrast, less excitement. Is there any focal point that you can point that our eyes go to first? Perhaps the area where the fruit is, right? There's almost a little kind of implied line that leads our eye upwards to a nice simple focal point. There are also some other important areas of emphasis that are made by these implied shapes of the triangles throughout the piece that help kind of lead our eye through the center of that picture plane. Let's see this piece by Goya, The Executions of the 3rd of May. This one's much more dramatic than a still life, right? Is there anywhere that you see as an area of emphasis? Clearly our action is happening right here in the middle of the scene. The subordinate areas of the dark background, less contrast, less light, very subordinate to the action that's happening in the middle. Could there be a focal point in this piece? Right here in the center of his chest, right? It's the same color scheme as Cézanne's, but it has a very different feeling, right? There's sort of drama and contrast. Also, the implied lines of the faces help to lead your eye down to the action that's happening. The next principle that we're going to talk about is scale and proportion. Scale is size in proportion to standard or normal size, the size we expect things to be. Proportion is size relationships between parts of a whole or between two or more objects perceived as a unit. Hierarchical scale indicates relative proportion and relative importance. So the bigger something is, the more important that object is. So let's look at a few examples and decide which one we're looking at: scale, proportion, or hierarchical scale. This is a piece by Oldenburg. It's called Plantor. You can guess what it's designed after. This is an example of scale. Scale means its size in relation to the standard or normal size. So this clearly is not the normal size of a gardening shovel, right? Oldenburg is known to love to play with this principle. He sees its unusual size as a surprise, and he thinks about it as if, every object that we see every day has to be designed by somebody. So he's sort of changing the way you look at something by playing with that scale. It's another example of one of Oldenburg's pieces, a very playful cherry on a spoon. This piece is from Cleveland, Ohio. This free stamp actually caused a big scandal there when it first came out because, as you know, Cleveland has sort of struggled with its self-image and in recent years had some real estate problems where they're saying you can give it all away for free. So you can see how this was sort of a scandal in that area. Oldenburg also plays around with scale and sort of the texture of objects. Oftentimes he makes hard things soft or soft things hard. You can see here with this playful piece of cake. It's a piece by Rene Magritte. What do you think this plays with, scale or proportion? This one is proportion. So Magritte is playing with illusion. So he's looking at parts of a whole to oneself. The top of the body should be much bigger in proportion to the bottom of the body. He's also playing around with proportion in the skies and changing the way things are tilting. Magritte was known to play with proportion in this way. The next example that we have of proportion is from Egyptian culture. Many cultures have developed a fixed set of proportions for depicting a correct or perfect human form. Ancient Egyptian artists relied on a square grid to cover the perfect proportions of figures. That's why they all look so similar. Here you can actually see that in an unfinished piece. You can see them gridding out, scaling the perfect proportions for each one of those figures. They believed that stylization was a part of the figure, that there was a certain way you should reproduce the eyes, the legs. That's why you see those kind of weird sideways legs or sideways head. You see them from all different perceptions. So you're seeing the eye from the front on the side of the head. You're seeing the foot, even though the leg might be turned forward. about this piece by El Greco? This one's also proportion. If you look at the figure on the top, it's meant to be Christ. He's sort of an elongated, much longer than life figure. If you look at that torso, you can really realize how long it is. He made his figures elongated and sinewy because he liked to think of them as candle flames. The flame-like figures were meant to burn with intensity, so he sort of picked out biblical moments and he used these sort of longer figures to help imply drama. This is Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man. One of the ancient artistic ideals from ancient Greece and Rome was that numerical mathematical relationships held the key to beauty, and that perfect human proportions reflected a divine order. Da Vinci is one of the artists who became fascinated with this idea of Vitruvius. Vitruvius was a Roman architect during the 1st century of BCE. And he wrote a book on architecture that was widely read during the Renaissance. Da Vinci related this idea to the perfected male form. So you can see that's why he's got the figure inside of a square and a circle. Renaissance believed that the human form, the Renaissance artists believed that the human form reflected God's perfection, that the perfection of the human body also showed God's perfection. So they were also interested in this idea of proportions and what's called the golden mean, or the golden section, and the golden rectangle. And it's a mathematical proportion that fascinated many artists and architects during this time. It was first discovered by the ancient Greeks that when you divide the length into 2 unequal segments in a way that the smaller segment has the same ratio as the larger segment, the ratio works out to be 1 to 1.618. This is what's called the golden rectangle. So when you start to divide these out, there's actually many places that this is seen. It relates to the spiraling outward growth of a shell. The Greeks also used this mathematical formula to design architectural structures like the Parthenon. You can see it like many fractals, they grow to create a larger whole. So it's repeated on and on until infinity. Oftentimes you see these nature and conch shells, fractals, you'll see them repeated within the branches of a tree. So like I said, this fascinated many artists, and many artists like to break the rules of the golden mean. Le Corbusier was an architect who was interested in breaking these rules. He used 2 overlapping sections of the golden mean and tried to make the human body fit it, which you can see that's not really an idealized human body, right? He decided to design buildings that would recreate these proportions. He thought they were beautiful, poetic, and practical. Although if you look, it looks a little bit like a mushroom house from maybe Mario Brothers. So the last type of proportion we're going to talk about is hierarchical proportion. If we look at this piece, this is a royal altar to the hand. They use proportion for symbolic and aesthetic reasons. What's the biggest thing in this piece? It's the king's head, right? The king is the largest central figure flanked symmetrically with his attendants. The use of scale is meant to indicate the relative importance of the king. He's the biggest because he's the most important. This is what's known as hierarchical scale. The king's head is also the largest. He was sometimes called the great head in this culture. We see this also in Western art. This is a piece of the Madonna and Child. And we see the most important figure in this piece, who's the largest, is the Madonna, right? All those other little figures are much smaller in proportion to her. Next, we're going to look at the principle of art, rhythm. Rhythm can be referred to as music and dance. So the natural rhythms of the earth, the seasons, the cycles of the moon, poetry, it all refers to rhythm. This next piece by Maya Lin shows natural rhythm as well. Maya Lin actually also did the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C., the famous wall. She's interested in earthworks, so she's actually created the rhythm of waves in a grassy hill. Those are carved out, man-made waves. There's another type of rhythm that you see here. That's natural rhythm. So the rhythm of the seasons, we could see. This won't look the same each time of year. The trees change, the grass gets greener, the grass gets browner. So whatever season that you look at this piece, it will be different. That shows the natural rhythm. It's a piece by Gustav Klimt. If you can see this piece here, there's different types of rhythm used, that natural rhythm that we talked about in the last piece. And if you look at the ground, there's the repeated shapes that change in different ways. The shapes of the trees, big trees versus little trees, that rhythm of the line, so there being similar lines but differences within it, are used to create that sort of natural rhythm of the forest. This next piece shows architectural rhythm. Rhythm can also mean a repetition of similar shapes in different ways. Which shapes do you see repeated in this piece? Well, there's actually a lot of different shapes. One of the major ones is the arch that we see here. We see that arch repeated in the doorway. We see it repeated in the windows. We see it repeated in the top. We see it going back into the hallway. And if we look on the next slide, we also see it repeated in the interior. So this artist really thought about the rhythm as we walk through the space and having those big arches carry us into the architectural space of the piece.